The river at the lower bend had torn through the timber banks, Mrs. Gable said, and the main road was entirely gone. Edith set the heavy flatiron down on its metal stand. She had not heard the older woman enter the kitchen. The rain outside was hitting the glass windows in long, solid sheets. It had rained for 2 days without a single break, turning the garden into a dark marsh and hiding the green hills behind a low wall of gray fog. Mrs. Gable stood by the door, wringing her checkered apron with hands that were rough and red from the autumn chill. She looked terrified, her voice shaking, as she explained that a large black carriage had skidded off the flooded track into the deep ditch near the broken crossing. A traveler was trapped inside, visible through the shattered window, and the local men said he looked badly hurt. Sam had already ridden out on the draft horse to fetch the nearest medical man from the upper township, but that was 11 miles away, over roads that were quickly turning into deep streams. Mrs. Gable looked at Edith with a heavy, pleading expression that Edith recognized instantly. It was the exact look the valley people used to give her father when a fever broke out or a bone snapped in the logging camps and they had nowhere else to turn for aid. Edith did not hesitate. She reached for her heavy woolen cloak hanging by the wooden door. The fabric was cold to the touch, holding the dampness of the season. She pulled the hood over her hair, pinning the silver clasp tightly at her throat, while Mrs. Gable watched her with wide, worried eyes from the corner of the small kitchen. Mrs. Gable told her she could not possibly go down to the flooded road alone in such a terrible storm, calling her a young woman with no protection. Edith replied simply that her father had gone out in weather far worse than this, 100 times to tend to the sick. She did not let her fingers shake, even though the damp chill had crept deep into the small house. She ordered the older woman to fetch the heavy leather medical bag from the shelf, light the oil lantern, and set a large iron kettle of clean water over the hearth fire. Edith did not wait for an argument, because she had learned at 22 years of age that waiting rarely changed the path ahead of her. Her father had been resting in the churchyard for 9 months, leaving her with a small, honest house that felt far too quiet. The house consisted of 3 small rooms below and 2 narrow bedrooms above, fronted by a garden that was slowly going to seed in the autumn dampness. Her father's brass nameplate still sat firmly on the wooden doorpost, as she had not yet found the heart to unscrew it. He had been the only healer within a day's ride, and the people of Gale Valley had loved him in the quiet, simple way of country folks who could not afford to waste words or emotion. When he passed, they had brought her fresh eggs, bundles of dry firewood, and a great deal of respectful silence, before returning to their hard daily labors. They had largely forgotten that a young woman remained in the doctor's house, surrounded by heavy leather books and sharp steel instruments, possessing all of his knowledge, but none of his public standing. Edith walked down the muddy lane with the oil lantern held low against the driving wind, the cold rain immediately finding the back of her neck. Twice her leather boots sank deep into the thick gray mud past her ankles, the earth trying to hold her back, but she pushed through until she reached the ditch. The black traveling carriage lay heavily on its side in the rushing brown water, one wooden wheel still spinning slowly in the wind like a dying thing. The led horse had broken its harness and fled into the trees, while the second horse stood shivering with its head bowed low in the downpour. A broad, gray-haired man in a dark livery coat knelt in the mud by the wreckage, holding his left arm tightly against his chest and groaning as the lantern light caught his pale, wet face. The servant looked up with a gasp of relief, asking if she was the doctor, to which Edith replied that she was the doctor's daughter. She scrambled past him without another word, pulling herself up onto the side of the overturned vehicle to reach the door, which now faced the sky like a ship's hatch. She asked how many people were inside, and the servant replied that there were only the 2 of them, his master being trapped below, after speaking briefly a minute ago. Edith gripped the iron handle and wrenched the heavy wooden door upward, until it stayed half open against the wind. Inside the dark cabin, crumpled against the shattered velvet cushions, was a tall man clad in dark traveling clothes, one hand pressed hard against his forehead and the other braced against the broken seat. The lantern light shifted across his face, revealing a long cut near his hairline, where thick blood ran down his temple in a dark, steady line. He was entirely conscious, his face perfectly still, as his eyes caught the lantern light and fixed upon her with a cold, absolute patience that she knew she would remember for a very long time. His hair was the color of fresh winter snow, stark white against the shadows, and his skin possessed a smooth, unearthly pallor that seemed entirely unaffected by the mud or the heat of his own blood. Edith told him firmly not to move until she had examined him, but his voice rose low and steady from the dark cabin, telling her to tend to his servant first, because the man's arm was badly injured. Edith told him the servant could easily wait 5 minutes, because he was currently sitting up and swearing in the mud, which was always a reliable sign of life. She braced her knee against the wooden frame of the carriage door and leaned further into the darkness, instructing the stranger to follow her moving finger with his eyes, without turning his neck. A small movement passed over his mouth, not quite a smile, as he followed her direction with eyes that were a pale, striking gray-green, the color of a willow leaf in morning frost. The cut across his brow was long but clean. His dark pupils were perfectly even, and when she pressed her fingers against the cold bones of his face, he did not flinch from any physical pain. He only pulled back slightly from her close presence, his breathing remaining slow and silent, as she pronounced that he would survive with nothing worse than a severe headache. The journey back up the flooded lane was far more difficult than the walk down had been, the wind howling through the pine trees of Gale Valley. The servant, whom the white-haired gentleman addressed simply as Davis, was able to walk on his own feet, but his left shoulder hung completely wrong beneath his torn coat. He was a proud, heavy man who clearly disliked leaning his bulk against a young woman, grunting in protest with every slippery step they took through the thick mud. The white-haired master walked mostly unaided, keeping one long, pale hand pressed against the stone wall of the hedgerow, while his other hand remained over his injured brow. He spoke not a single word during the entire trek, though twice he paused to look back toward the ruined carriage in the dark ditch, as if he were leaving something important behind. Inside the kitchen, Mrs. Gable had built the hearth fire high, until the big copper kettle was screaming with steam, casting a bright orange glow across the wooden floorboards. The older woman took one long look at the two soaked strangers dripping muddy water onto her clean stone flags, and chose to say nothing about the propriety of the situation. Edith thanked her silently for her restraint, directing the men to the warmth of the hearth and telling Davis to sit in the hard wooden chair by the lamp. She decided to set the coachman's shoulder first, because a joint out of its socket was a distinct cruelty that should never be made to wait for comfort. She had watched her father perform this exact task dozens of times during her youth, and had successfully completed it twice, under his direct, watchful eye. Edith stepped behind the large servant, placing her boot firmly against the base of his ribs for leverage, then took his thick wrist in both of her hands. She turned the arm and pulled with a long, slow, deliberate pressure that looked like very little effort, but required every ounce of strength in her shoulders. The joint slipped back into its proper place, with a loud, sharp crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping in the winter woods. Davis let out a sound that was half a shout and half a sob, before astonishingly bursting into a rough laugh, declaring that the job was done perfectly. He remarked that he had seen experienced military surgeons make a far worse mess of a shoulder, sitting still as she began to bind the arm with clean white cotton strips. The entire time she worked on the servant, Edith was acutely aware of the white-haired gentleman watching her silently from the wooden settle by the fire. He held a piece of coarse linen against his forehead to catch the blood, his pale gray-green eyes unblinking as they followed the precise movements of her chapped hands. She was entirely accustomed to being looked at by the local farmers as if she were merely a piece of the household furniture, but this gaze felt entirely different. This was the look of a man who examined a thing because he intended to understand its exact nature, his eyes holding a heavy, ancient focus that made the skin on her arms prickle. When she finally stepped away from Davis and approached the master with her basin of warm water, he did not move a single muscle. She worked by the combined light of a single tallow candle and the dying fire, her face only a hand's breadth away from his cold, smooth features as she cleaned the wound. His skin felt like smooth riverstone left in a winter creek, devoid of the normal heat of a living man, and his white hair caught the light like polished silver. She told him the thread would sting as she prepared her needle, but he merely told her to proceed, his voice dry and entirely steady. She drew the split skin together with 3 small, even stitches, working with the precise rhythm her father had drilled into her during their long years together in the valley. The gentleman did not make a sound or twitch a muscle, though his long fingers closed slowly into a tight fist against his knee, before opening again when she finished. Edith sat back and wiped her hands on a dry cloth, telling him he would have a small scar above his brow, but it would not completely spoil his appearance. The stranger remarked dryly that he was not aware he possessed anything worth spoiling, to which she replied that every person had something of value if they looked closely enough. She asked for his name so she could record it in her father's medical ledger and know who was sleeping under her roof, as she disliked nursing a man she could not name. A small, strange pause followed her question, a held second of absolute stillness that she did not fully think about then, though she would remember it clearly much later. He looked at her over the bloody linen and stated simply that his name was Tristan, offering nothing more to explain his presence in the valley. Edith asked for his family name, but he repeated that Tristan would do well enough, his pale eyes remaining fixed on her face, as he noted her own identity as the doctor's daughter. She confirmed her name, lifting the heavy brass basin of pink water, and told him he would occupy her father's old bedroom upstairs, because the sheets were clean and aired. She assigned Davis to the wide wooden settle by the kitchen fire, where she could keep a watchful eye on his injured shoulder throughout the night. She informed them both that in the morning they would determine what could be done about their journey, though nothing could be attempted tonight with the bridge destroyed. Tristan remained quiet for a long moment, the fire snapping between them, as he remarked that she was remarkably calm for a woman alone with 2 strange men. Edith looked at him steadily, stating that she had buried both of her parents and half the residents of the parish before she reached her current age. She told him there was very little left in the wide world that could truly frighten her, least of all, a man who could take 3 stitches without flinching. She wished him a good night, took her small candle, and walked up the creaking wooden stairs to her own small room under the eaves. Behind her, in the dim firelight, she left a ruler of the night sitting in a country doctor's kitchen, with blood on his collar and thread in his brow. Tristan watched the heavy wooden door she had closed as if it were the most interesting object he had encountered in 100 years of travel. Tristan did not sleep that night, nor did he possess the capacity for the deep, heavy slumber of the mortal men who farmed the rocky soil of Gale Valley. He lay perfectly still upon the narrow horsehair mattress of the dead physician's bed, his long white hair spread against the white linen pillow like winter frost. He listened to the steady, monotonous rhythm of the autumn rain against the glass window, his senses tracing the small movements of the young woman sleeping in the room across the hall. He was Tristan, the absolute ruler of the northern night, master of the massive stone towers at White Peak, and 11,000 acres of dark timberland. He held ancient titles that had been carved into stone before the valley towns were ever named, yet he lay in a simple room that smelled of dried lavender and old paper. He had left his great stone estate 4 days prior with only Davis and a plain, uncrested carriage, because the weight of his court had grown too heavy for him to bear. Once or twice a year, he found it necessary to step out into the wider world as a man of no particular consequence, paying for his own bread and listening to plain speech. It was the single indulgence he permitted his cold nature, a brief escape from the endless lines of bowing servants and high-born ladies who rearranged their faces the moment he entered. His stewards believed he was inspecting the distant timber mills, while his ancient grandmother knew the truth of his wanderings and chose to keep her silent counsel. He had certainly not planned for the river to rise, nor had he planned to be pulled from a muddy ditch by a doctor's daughter with sharp words. He turned his head slightly on the pillow, the 3 small stitches above his gray-green eye, pulling gently against his cold flesh, as he recalled the touch of her fingers. Her hands had been small, rough from hard work, and entirely devoid of the trembling fear that usually accompanied mortals when they drew near his cold presence. He thought of the way she had ordered him to remain still, treating his royal person with the same practical indifference she showed to the muddy tools in her outhouse. Every soul he had encountered for a century had known his title before he ever spoke, their opinions shifting like shadows to match his own desires, until he forgot the man inside the crown. In this small, quiet house, he was merely an injured traveler, named Tristan, who had been clumsy enough to overturn his carriage in a common ditch. The road did not open when the pale morning light finally broke through the gray clouds, nor did it open on the morning that followed the storm. The river remained high, a brown and roaring torrent that threw broken logs against the stone pilings of the valley crossing, until the entire middle span collapsed. Word came up from the small cluster of houses by the mill that it would take a fortnight and a skilled stonemason before any horse could cross dry. Davis's shoulder required several days of absolute stillness to heal properly, and the cut on Tristan's brow needed to be watched for signs of inflammation. Thus, a strange, quiet routine settled over the doctor's small house, a suspended period of time that none of them had actively chosen, but none wished to break. Edith kept them fed from her meager winter stores, a task that was far from easy given the sudden arrival of 2 large men with hearty appetites. Her pantry had been thin before their arrival, her savings small and hard-won, but she was the daughter of a man who had often been paid in firewood or salt pork. She knew how to stretch a small loaf of wheat bread and a single pot of cabbage soup across several days, without letting her guests see her count the pieces. Tristan observed her care nonetheless, his pale eyes missing nothing as he sat by the kitchen hearth during the long, idle afternoons of the first week. By the end of the second day, he had learned the entire inner working of her poor household, without asking a single formal question. He knew which wooden shutter rattled in the north wind, which iron hinge cried out for grease, and that the stone chimney smoked whenever the wind came low over the hills. He noticed that Mrs. Gable's knees pained her whenever she carried the heavy wooden water bucket up the 3 garden steps from the well. Most of all, he saw that Edith always took the smallest portion of salt meat at the dinner table, claiming it was her long-standing habit. On the 3rd morning of their confinement, she found him out by the woodpile, without his heavy coat, his linen sleeves turned up to reveal pale, strong forearms. He held her father's old iron hammer in one hand, and 3 rusted nails between his lips as he examined the broken window shutter. He had removed the warped piece of pine from its rusted hinges, and was now smoothing the swollen edge with a small hand plane he had discovered in the shed. He worked with the unhurried, perfect competence of a man who took pleasure in the physical weight of tools, his movements silent and remarkably graceful. Edith stood in the doorway and told him he had no need to trouble himself with the repairs, but he did not look up from his work. He replied through the nails that the rattling had annoyed him for 2 days, stating he had a very low tolerance for things that remained broken when they could be mended. He fitted the wooden shutter back onto its frame, and it swung perfectly true, closing tightly against the autumn wind, without a single sound of complaint. Tristan looked at the finished window with a quiet, genuine satisfaction that Edith found surprisingly human for a man who seemed so entirely removed from the valley. He suggested that he pay for his daily bread in the currency of hinges and repairs, as he carried no common coin within his traveling coat. She allowed him to continue, telling herself that a mended house was worth more than her pride, though in truth, she found comfort in watching him work. There was a strange peace in the care he took, testing the swing of the wood twice until it was perfectly right, before moving to the next task. His steady, silent labor reached into her quiet heart, turning a key in a lock she had thought rusted shut since her father died. By the 5th day of the great flood, the small house began to stand straighter on its old stone foundations than it had in many years of neglect. Tristan mended the broken latches on the kitchen cupboards, fixed the loose floorboard that had tripped her father, and cleared the dead leaves from the roof gutters. When Davis's arm was strong enough to assist, the two men rehung the heavy door of the woodshed and repaired the collapsed fence near the road. Edith watched them from the kitchen window, wondering occasionally what kind of merchant's agent or land surveyor handled a common hand plane with such effortless grace. She assumed he was a man from the great southern cities, sent north on some business for a wealthy estate, though such men rarely spent their days clearing mud. It is a peculiar truth that human beings often ask the fewest questions of the individuals they most desperately wish to keep within their quiet lives. At dusk on the 6th day, Edith walked out to the small barn to gather the dry straw and stopped silently in the shadow of the wooden doorway. Davis sat upon an upturned wooden bucket, his mended arm resting securely in its linen sling, while Tristan stood by the lantern at the workbench. The master was repairing a broken leather bridle for her old pony, his white hair shining like silver against the dark wood of the barn walls. The two men were entirely silent, moving around the small space with a long-standing habit of absolute trust that required no spoken words between them. Edith understood in that quiet moment that whatever Tristan truly was in the world outside Gale Valley, he was a leader whom other men would follow into the dark. She stood in the blue chill of the evening air and watched the steady movement of his pale hands, feeling the peace of these suspended days settle deeper into her. She went back into the warm kitchen and set a third plate at the wooden table, saying nothing to the older woman about her thoughts. She lay awake that night listening to the water drop from the roof, realizing she was happier than she had been in a very long time. For 9 months, she had believed the interesting portion of her life was buried in the earth, but now the hours had color again. The long evenings were the true danger to her resolve, for the daylight hours contained hard labor, and labor is a wall behind which a person can easily hide. When the light failed early in the autumn fog, the small kitchen grew dark, leaving nothing to do but sit by the low embers of the hearth. The tallow candles were lit, the fire was banked with wet peat, and Davis regularly went off to snore loudly upon the long wooden settle. The silence between Edith and Tristan began to feel like a physical room they were both inhabiting, their eyes meeting across the shadows with increasing frequency. On the 7th night, he took down an old leather-bound volume of history from her father's shelf and began to read aloud in his low voice. He read well, his voice holding a steady, rhythmic cadence that made the old sentences sound plain and important, while she mended her winter stockings by the fire. Now and then he would pause, and they would speak of the old kings who had ruled the northern mountains before the towns were built. She noted that he had thought deeply about many things, though he carried himself as if he had no opinions of consequence to share with a country girl. She looked up from her needlework on the 8th evening and told him directly that he had never been raised to be a simple clerk or land agent. His white hands held the book with too much authority, and he looked at her small house as a ruler looks at a distant province. Tristan set the old book down upon his knee, his pale eyes turning toward the glowing embers of the fire, rather than looking at her face in the dark. He stated quietly that he had been raised to be worth precisely what he was born to inherit, being counted by his title before he was ever known. He spoke of walking into grand rooms where every human face rearranged itself around his position, until he could not tell if a single soul liked the man. Edith put her darning down, telling him it was the truest thing he had said since the river had thrown his carriage into her ditch. She shared her own fear then, speaking of the dread of growing old in the valley while being useful only to people who forgot her name. By the 10th day, the brown waters of the river had finally begun to fall back into the rocky channel, leaving thick gray mud along the banks. Sam rode his old horse up the mended lane with news from the village, shouting that the crossing could be managed if a man did not mind wet knees. A supply cart from the lower town had reached the grain mill, signaling that the ordinary world was finally breaking through their small, quiet sanctuary. Edith received the news with a polite smile that did not touch her eyes, noticing the same dark shadow pass across Tristan's pale face. That afternoon, a young village boy named Leo came to the kitchen door, his mother having sent him up to the doctor's house because of a deep thorn. The boy was 7 years old, holding his swollen hand with a great deal of quiet dignity, determined not to cry in front of the tall strangers. Edith sat him upon the heavy wooden table, drawing the sharp splinter out with a clean steel needle, while the boy stared fixedly at the ceiling. Tristan came in from the yard during the middle of the task, stopping dead in the doorway, as his gray-green eyes fixed upon the small child. A look of sudden, intense tenderness passed over his pale features, before he quickly mastered it, looking like a man who watched a warm home through a glass window. Edith bound the small hand in clean linen and lifted the boy down, telling him to keep the skin dry on his walk home. The boy reached the kitchen door, then paused to look up at the tall, white-haired stranger, who blocked the gray daylight from the yard outside. Leo asked innocently if Tristan was the doctor's husband, causing the small room to fall into an absolute, breathless silence for several long seconds. Tristan knelt down so his cold face was level with the child's eyes, stating simply that he was merely a man she had pulled from a ditch. He said he had been trying to be worth the trouble ever since, an answer that the boy considered with grave fairness before running out into the lane. In the quiet that followed the banging of the wooden door, Edith and Tristan looked at each other across the warm room, saying nothing at all. 2 days later, the hired horses arrived from the lower town, accompanied by a brief written message that Davis delivered to his master by the window. Tristan read the paper with his back turned to the room, his long white hair catching the bright morning light that came through the mended shutter. When he turned around, his features had settled back into the cold, distant expression of a high-born noble, signaling that their suspended time had ended. Edith helped Davis into his heavy traveling coat, wrapping a loaf of fresh rye bread and 3 pieces of dried beef in a clean cloth for their journey. She stood in the open doorway with her arms folded against the sharp autumn wind, watching Tristan settle his dark hat upon his silver hair. He looked at her for a long moment, stating that he owed her far more than could ever be repaid through mended shutters and fixed gates. She replied that he owed her nothing at all, as she had merely practiced her father's honest trade upon an injured traveler in a common storm. He held her gray eyes with his own, confessing that he had inhabited many grand houses, but this was the first he was truly sorry to leave. He asked if he might have her permission to write to her from his home, causing her heart to do a foolish, sudden thing against her ribs. She told him a great lord did not write to a country doctor's daughter without meaning something by it, and she knew he was not a common man. The formal letter arrived exactly 8 days after the black carriage had ridden out of Gale Valley, carried by a young groom in midnight blue livery. The horse he rode was a magnificent black beast, worth more than Edith's entire house, its silver bit stamping in the mud of her small gate. The heavy parchment was sealed with a massive circle of dark red wax, bearing a royal crest that she had never seen in her life. Mrs. Gable brought the letter into the kitchen, holding the paper away from her skirt as if it were a weapon that might explode. Edith broke the wax seal by the window, reading the spidery, imperious handwriting of an old woman who identified herself as Lady Augusta. The letter stated that Tristan had returned to the great stone towers of White Peak, altered and silent, snapping at the household servants without cause. The old matriarch wrote that she knew Edith had stitched his head and fed him for a fortnight without asking for a single favor or piece of silver. She revealed that Tristan was the king of the night, the vampire ruler who held dominion over the entire northern territory from his ancient castle. Lady Augusta commanded Edith to come to the estate on Thursday, warning her that malicious gossip was already spreading through the county high courts. The local lords were talking about the young doctor's daughter, who had sheltered the king alone in a remote cottage for 2 weeks. Edith sat down heavily upon the wooden chair, her face turning the color of the white linen cloth on the table as the truth hit her. She realized she had been lecturing the ruler of the night about his table manners while feeding him simple rabbit stew by her kitchen fire. The deception did not hurt her as deeply as the smaller, sharper realization that she had opened her inner heart to a king. She had believed him to be a fellow traveler in the quiet country of the overlooked, yet he had stood on the other side of her door. He had known her ignorance, and had chosen to keep the secret like a comfortable room he could leave whenever his holiday ended. She almost refused to enter the carriage when it arrived on Thursday morning, her father's quiet, cold anger burning steadily within her breast against the deceit. She remembered every plain word she had spoken to him, every shared hour by the hearth, feeling like an amusement for a wealthy lord who played at poverty. But she knew the county would make her name into a shameful story if she remained hidden within her small kitchen in Gale Valley. A woman who had sheltered a king alone for a fortnight would be ruined in the market towns if she did not face the talk. She put on her best gray woolen gown, which was 3 years old but perfectly clean, and walked out to the carriage with her chin high. The great stone gates of White Peak Estate were larger than any building Edith had ever seen, the long stone avenue lined with ancient, bare trees. The castle walls were built of dark, cold rock that had stood for 3 centuries, the high windows staring down like silent judges upon her arrival. The servants took her heavy cloak in a hall floored with pale stone, under a ceiling that was lost in deep, heavy shadows. She passed rows of old oil portraits, showing men with the same pale white hair and gray-green eyes, all looking down with cold indifference. They led her to a small, circular chamber at the heart of the stone fortress, where the walls were hung with heavy rose-colored silk. An extremely old woman sat perfectly upright in a high-backed chair by a roaring fire, a silver-headed cane resting across her small knees. Lady Augusta had 2 black eyes that remained sharp and clear, her face like a clever hawk as she examined Edith from head to foot. She told Edith she was not a common beauty, to which Edith replied that she had come to speak the plain truth to the house. Edith stated that Tristan had allowed her to believe they were equals while he possessed everything, calling the action something her father would have named. The old lady's eyes glittered with sudden amusement, as she remarked that the proper word for his behavior was cowardice, though it dressed very well. Augusta explained that Tristan had been looked at every single day of his long life, but had been truly known by no one until the flood. He was terrified of being nothing but his ancient title, running away in a plain coat to escape the endless worship of his court. She said Edith had treated him precisely like a common man, for the first time in a century, and he did not know how to survive. The old queen then warned her that Lady Beatrice Finch, who had expected to marry the king for 9 years, was spreading rumors. Beatrice intended to make Edith a shameful byword in the market towns to protect her own claim to the white throne of the Northern Knight. Tristan entered the rose silk room at dusk, still clad in his dark riding clothes, the small pale scar above his brow catching the firelight. He stopped dead when he saw Edith sitting across from his grandmother, his gray-green eyes opening wide with an unguarded second of pure shock. Then his features settled back into the cold, perfect mask of the King of the Night, his white hair shining under the candles. Edith rose and curtsied low, addressing him formally as His Grace, a title that landed upon him like a physical blow after their kitchen days. He told her he had known he would have to stand before her and hear her anger from the moment the letter was sent. He admitted fully that he had built their weeks together upon a total lie, calling it a selfish holiday, from the heavy burden of his crown. He stated that he had broken the one clean place where he had ever been, simply a man, offering his deep apologies without defense. Edith replied that being sorry was an easy thing to manage within a warm palace, telling him she intended to return home. Lady Augusta interrupted from her chair, striking her cane against the stone floor to command their absolute attention in the quiet room. The old woman stated firmly that Edith could not return to Gale Valley because Lady Beatrice would ensure her total social ruin within the month. Augusta declared that the only action that could answer the High Court and protect the doctor's name was an immediate marriage between the two of them. She told them they already knew each other better than most couples did after a year of formal drawing-room conversations in the capital. She suggested they marry as a plain bargain to stop the malicious talk, leaving them time to discover if their kitchen friendship was real. Tristan turned to Edith fully, his pale face earnest, as he stated the terms of the bargain in words a doctor's daughter could weigh. He promised her total independence, her own rooms, and her own income, swearing he would never enter her presence uninvited. He confessed that he did not want her merely to stop the local scandal, admitting he had cared for her since she first ordered him still. He said if she married him only to save her family name, and never gave him another inch of her heart, he would remain content. Edith looked at the white-haired king for a long time, recognizing the truth in his cold features as he laid his heart open. She agreed to the marriage upon her own written conditions, stating he would have to earn her regard as Tristan, not as a king. Lady Augusta thumped her cane with enormous satisfaction, calling it the first sensible arrangement made within the ancient family in 60 long years. They were married 3 weeks later, in the small, unadorned stone chapel at the edge of the White Peak estate, during a quiet morning. The only witnesses were Lady Augusta, the faithful Davis, Mrs. Gable, and 3 elderly tenants who had known the doctor during his early years. Edith refused to wear the white silks or heavy jewels that the palace servants brought to her room, choosing instead her plain gray gown. She wore her mother's small pearl cross at her throat, her white hair bound tightly behind her head as she signed the legal contract. Tristan signed his name beneath hers with a heavy iron pen, agreeing to every strict clause she had laid down for their union. The contract ensured she retained her father's small house in the valley, her own separate funds, and the right to practice her healing arts. One specific rule made the king's mouth move. In that familiar, almost smile, he was to call her Edith, never your grace, whenever they were alone. She became the mistress of a stone fortress, with 100 empty rooms, discovering within a single week that grandeur was a very cold comfort. The great house was a massive machine, designed to keep people apart, filled with silent footmen and long, polished corridors that echoed with emptiness. She had married to answer the judgment of the world, but she had not fully reckoned on the heavy silence of the night. She spent her long, empty days learning the strange geography of the estate, walking through the chilly portrait galleries where the dead rulers hung. She chose a small parlor on the south side for her own use because it was the single corner that caught the morning sun. Tristan kept his solemn promise with absolute care, never appearing in her rooms unless she sent a formal request through the servants. He did, however, have her father's old medical books placed upon the finest mahogany shelves in the library, arranging a bright oil lamp beside them. He left a large, blank ledger on the writing desk, its leather spine neatly lettered in gold, with her father's honest name. Edith began to visit the distant cottages on the estate lands, bringing her medicine bag to the wives of the woodcutters and the shepherds. She treated the children for winter coughs and dressed the rough hands of the laborers, asking for nothing but their honest cooperation in return. Lady Beatrice Finch observed these movements from her own estate, remarking loudly to the county ladies that the new queen smelled of the sick room. Beatrice suggested that a doctor's girl belonged among the Boyles rather than leading the annual winter assembly at the grand town hall. The cruel words returned to Edith through the servants, but she kept her chin high and continued her daily work among the poor. Tristan found her in the dark library late one April night, the hearth fire burning low and her father's gold-lettered ledger open on her lap. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before asking quietly if he might sit across from her without causing any disturbance. She moved the branch of brass candles to make a space for him, and he took his seat, picking up the old book. For an hour, the massive stone room felt no larger than the small kitchen in Gale Valley had felt during the great autumn flood. This quiet meeting became their regular habit, a silent agreement to share the dark hours after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. Over many such nights, Tristan spoke of the long centuries he had lived behind his cold mask, valued only for the continuation of his line. He spoke of his mother who had passed away too early, and the long gray certainty that he was merely a crown without a man. He told her the fortnight in her kitchen had been the only place he had ever truly wanted to remain in his life. Edith listened to his low voice, looking at the pale scar above his eye, and realized she had finally forgiven his initial deceit. She told him she knew the man inside the king now, and that was the individual she had chosen to keep. Lady Beatrice Finch arrived at White Peak in the middle of spring, her grand carriage stopping before the stone steps without any formal invitation. She was a beautiful woman, with dark hair and a sweet voice, that always arrived a half-second before the coldness in her eyes. She curtsied to Edith with expert, calculated insult, noting the plainness of her gray wool dress compared to her own bright silks. Beatrice stayed 3 days at the castle, practicing 100 small, sweet cruelties designed to make Edith feel like an ignorant outsider. She told long stories of Tristan's youth, drawing a bright, closed circle that kept the king inside and left the doctor's daughter out. The final blow was delivered during a formal dinner party on the 3rd evening, surrounded by 12 wealthy lords and ladies of the province. Beatrice lifted her clear voice down the length of the long table, asking if the rumors about the unchaperoned fortnight were completely true. The entire room fell into a heavy, breathless silence as the guests waited to see the country girl break under the public shame. Tristan grew perfectly still at the head of the table, his white hands tightening around his silver glass until the metal groaned. Edith caught his pale eyes across the candles and stopped him with a single, slight movement of her fingers. She stood up at her place, her voice carrying down the long room with the steady, calm authority of a healer in a crisis. She confirmed every detail of the story, explaining that 2 hurt strangers had needed her father's skill during a dangerous river flood. She stated that if saving a man's life and asking for nothing in return was a scandal, she would gladly own it. She looked directly at Beatrice, suggesting that the noblewoman was troubled only because Tristan had stayed in the kitchen without his crown. The beautiful, cruel face of Lady Beatrice crumpled for 1 naked second, revealing a deep, human terror of a life left entirely empty. Edith did not strike her rival again, choosing to offer her more wine and turning the conversation toward the quality of the winter wheat. The table's sympathy turned instantly toward the quiet dignity of the woman in gray, leaving the high-born beauty defeated at her own game. Tristan found Edith afterward in the dark portrait gallery, telling her she had been magnificent in her defense of their small history. She turned from the window, stating she had acted out of pity for a woman who had just lost her entire world. He looked down at her with his pale gray-green eyes, declaring that she was the only soul who had ever come looking for the man beneath the crown. The future stretched out before Edith like a long, quiet road through the hills of Gale Valley, no longer frightening in its silence. She stood by the high stone window of the nursery 3 years later, watching the first white flakes of a winter storm drift down. Her small son slept soundly in the wooden cradle behind her, his small chin holding the exact, stubborn shape of her father's family line. Tristan walked into the warm room with his silent, graceful step, placing his cold hands gently over her shoulders as they looked out. They had taught the great stone house to hold its breath no longer, filling the cold rooms with the honest warmth of human life. She knew they would face many more storms in the long years ahead, for the world outside their valley was full of judgment and change. But she possessed the plain, sure knowledge that was the only true fortune she had ever trusted since her 22nd year. They had built a bridge between the light and the dark, board by board, using the simple currency of truth and useful labor. She set her hand over his plain gold ring, knowing that as long as a single candle burned steady in the window, no traveler would ever be entirely lost in the cold night. The rest of their long history would look after itself, rooted deeply in the small kitchen where a stranger had first knocked upon an honest door.